Sometimes the smallest act of mercy is the one that echoes the longest. The snow had already begun to gather along the edges of the road when Caleb Ward first saw the house at the end of Briar Hollow Lane, standing beneath a gray Ohio sky like something the world had forgotten to claim. He eased his old pickup to the shoulder, the tires whispering over slush, and sat for a moment with both hands resting on the wheel. Beside him, his German Shepherd, Ranger, lifted his head and stared through the windshield with those steady amber eyes that never seemed to miss anything. Caleb was 42, broad-shouldered, quiet, and marked by years that had taught him to speak less and notice more. He had once worn a uniform for his country, but these days he wore a worn canvas coat, work boots crusted with road salt, and a silence that lived deep in his chest. People in small towns often looked at him and saw only a tired veteran, another man carrying the weight of old roads and newer losses, but Ranger knew better. Ranger always knew better. The old house ahead of them was not grand, not even especially beautiful, but there was something about it that held the eye. Its white paint had gone soft with age, its front porch leaned slightly to the left, and one of the upstairs windows was veiled by a curtain that had likely not moved in years. Wind slipped around the corners of the roof and sent a low, hollow sound through the bare trees, as if the place were breathing in its sleep. Caleb stepped out into the cold and shut the truck door gently. The air smelled of wet pine, old wood, and the clean metallic bite of winter. Ranger jumped down beside him and stood close, tail low, ears alert, his paws pressing into the frozen dirt with careful patience. At the gate, Caleb found a hand-painted sign hung by rusted wire, "Amarist Adeline Hart, please knock." He had never met her, only heard her name from the woman at the feed store in town, who said Mrs. Hart was 96 years old, alone now, and still living in the house she had shared with her husband for more than 60 years. Caleb had gone there expecting nothing more than a favor, the kind veteran's stories often begin with and never seem to end the same way. 3 days earlier, he had stopped to help a stranger whose car had slid into a ditch along the county road. The driver had been an elderly man with trembling hands and a grocery bag full of canned soup spilled across the snow. Caleb had spent an hour digging the tires free, then followed him home to make sure he got inside safely. The man had thanked him with tears in his eyes and said very little, but kindness, Caleb had learned long ago, rarely announced itself loudly. It simply stayed. Now, as he approached the porch, Ranger moved ahead of him and paused at the first step, nose lifted toward the door. He let out one low bark, not sharp, just certain. Caleb looked down at him and frowned slightly. "What is it, boy?" he murmured. Ranger did not answer, of course, but his posture changed, subtle and immediate, as though some invisible thread had pulled taut inside him. Caleb reached for the brass knocker. Before his knuckles touched it, the door opened. Mrs. Hart stood there in a soft blue cardigan with silver hair pinned neatly back, her face lined like a cherished old map, every crease holding a memory. Her eyes, pale and alert, settled first on Caleb, then on Ranger, and a slow smile touched her mouth. "You must be the soldier who helped my brother," she said. Caleb gave a modest nod. "I just gave him a hand, ma'am." "No," she said gently. "You gave him dignity." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Behind her, a house glowed with warm lamplight, and the faint smell of cinnamon and tea drifted into the cold. Caleb felt something unfamiliar loosen in him, something small and guarded that had been clenched for years. Mrs. Hart stepped back and opened the door wider. "Come in before the cold steals your breath," she said. Ranger entered first, careful and quiet, his nails sticking softly on the old hardwood floor. Caleb followed, removing his cap, and the world outside seemed to fall away behind him. Inside, the house was hushed in the way old places often are, not empty, but attentive. A wooden clock clicked from somewhere in the hallway. Framed photographs lined the mantel, black and white faces smiling from another century. A knit blanket lay folded over the back of a chair. Every room carried the gentle weight of memory. Mrs. Hart led him toward the kitchen, where a kettle was singing faintly on the stove. "I was hoping you'd come," she said. Caleb glanced at her, surprised. "You were?" She nodded, as if the answer had been obvious all along. Kind men usually try to leave before anyone can thank them properly. But I've learned that some gifts arrive only when they are ready. Ranger stopped near the doorway and looked toward the back of the house, his ears angling toward something beyond the kitchen wall. Then he gave a soft whine and took 2 careful steps in that direction. Caleb noticed at once. "He does that when he thinks something matters," he said. Mrs. Hart's expression changed, not fear, not exactly, but recognition. "Then perhaps," she whispered, "he's feeling what my husband felt before he passed." She turned toward the far hall, where the wallpaper had faded to the color of old parchment. At the end of it stood a narrow door with a tarnished latch and a curtain of dust along its frame. Caleb had not noticed it when he came in, but now it seemed to draw the eye with a quiet force. Mrs. Hart folded her hands together. "That room has been shut for 37 years, she said, her voice barely above a breath. "And tonight, for the first time, I think it may finally be opened." Ranger pressed closer to Caleb's leg, his body still awake. Caleb looked from the old door to the woman beside him, and for reasons he could not yet explain, he felt the shape of something larger gathering just beyond the silence. Some doors, he would soon learn, do not open for curiosity. They open for mercy. The room seemed to hold its breath as Caleb stood beside Mrs. Hart, the old hallway dim and hushed around them. Ranger remained close, his ears forward, his body alert in the quiet way that only deep instinct could explain. Caleb did not reach for the narrow door at once. He simply watched it, feeling the strange pull of it, as though the house itself had been waiting for someone patient enough to listen. Mrs. Hart moved first. She crossed the faded runner on the floor. With careful steps and lifted the tarnished latch. It gave with a soft, reluctant sound, like a sigh after a very long prayer. A thread of cold air slipped out from the crack, carrying the scent of cedar, dust, and something older still, something that reminded Caleb of rain-soaked wood after a storm had passed. He glanced at Mrs. Hart, and she gave him a look that was not fear, but sorrow tempered by time. "I have not opened this door since my husband died," she said quietly. "After that, I told myself there was no need to disturb what remained." Her voice trembled on the last word, and Caleb understood without being told that grief had made a sanctuary of that room, and silence had guarded it ever since. The door opened wider. Inside, the room was small, nearly square, and touched by the pale glow of the hallway lamp behind them. Dust floated in the air like tiny sparks caught in a beam of light. A narrow bed stood against the wall, covered with a quilt folded so neatly it seemed placed there only yesterday. A writing desk sat beneath a window with cracked glass, and on the desk rested a metal box the color of weathered iron. Ranger stepped over the threshold first, then stopped, his nose lifted toward the far corner where the shadows gathered thickest. Caleb followed his gaze, but all he saw at first was an old chair, a lamp with a yellowed shade, and a shelf lined with books that had long ago gone soft at the edges. Yet the dog did not move. His tail lowered. His body stayed fixed toward the corner, and a low sound rose in his chest, not quite a growl, more like warning wrapped in grief. Caleb knelt beside him, resting one hand along his back. "What is it, boy?" he murmured. Ranger did not answer, of course, but his eyes stayed trained on the same dark place, and Caleb felt the old familiar tension rise in him, the one he knew from years of reading landscapes that seemed calm until they were not. Mrs. Hart came to stand at the desk. She touched the metal box with the tips of her fingers, as though it might vanish if held too firmly. "That belonged to my husband," she said. "He told me once that if the time ever came, I would know where to find what mattered." Caleb looked at her. "Did he say what was inside?" She shook her head. "Only that it was not for pride, and not for money. He said it was for the person who still believed the heart of a home could outlive the hands that built it." The words settled over the room with a weight that felt gentle and immense at the same time. Caleb rose slowly and took the box in both hands. It was heavier than it looked, and when he lifted it, a faint rattle came from within, like a key tapping against metal. He noticed then what Ranger had noticed before him, a narrow seam in the floorboards beneath the desk, almost invisible except for a line of cleaner wood hidden under the dust. The dog trotted to it and sat down, staring with urgent stillness. Caleb crouched again, running his fingers along the seam until he found the edge of a concealed panel. His pulse quickened, not from fear, but from the unmistakable sense that the house was revealing a memory it had held too long. Mrs. Hart drew in a breath. "I never knew that was there," she whispered. Caleb carefully lifted the panel. Beneath it lay a small recess in the floor, and inside the recess was a leather journal wrapped in a cloth gone soft with age, along with several envelopes tied together by a faded ribbon. The sight of them made Mrs. Hart bring a hand to her mouth. For a moment no one spoke. Even the house seemed to grow still, as if listening. Caleb lifted the journal first. The cover was cracked, but a name remained pressed into the leather, partly worn, partly clear enough to read. He did not say it aloud. Some things, he knew, ought to be honored before they are understood. He opened the first page and saw handwriting that was firm despite age, careful and deliberate, the script of a man who had once believed words could keep a promise alive. The entries were not long, only fragments at first. Dates. Weather. Small notes about repairs, visitors, groceries left on the porch. Then, buried among the ordinary lines, he found a sentence that made him pause. It said that the house had once been meant for 2 futures, not 1. Caleb read it twice. Ranger shifted beside him, then gave a soft waff and nudged the journal as if urging him onward. Mrs. Hart lowered herself into the chair by the desk, her hands clasped tight in her lap. Her eyes glistened, but she did not wipe them away. "I think," she said softly, "there is something in those pages I was never meant to find until tonight." Caleb turned another page. There, tucked between 2 entries, was a folded note in a different hand, addressed simply to whoever remained. The paper trembled in his fingers as he opened it. The message inside was brief, yet it carried the weight of a lifetime. It spoke of gratitude, of a promise kept in hard years, and of a final wish that whatever had been hidden here would one day help someone who had nearly given up on being found. Caleb felt his throat tighten. Not because the note was grand, but because it was not. It was the kind of quiet kindness that asks for nothing and somehow outlives everything else. Outside, the wind moved along the windows with a soft, mournful sound. Inside, Ranger pressed his shoulder gently against Caleb's leg, steadying him in the stillness. Mrs. Hart looked from the journal to the envelopes, then back to Caleb, and in her face he saw the first hint of release, the kind that comes when sorrow finally makes room for truth. There was more in the recess, he could feel it, more hidden in the old house, more waiting under layers of dust and memory. But in that moment, none of it felt like a puzzle to be solved. It felt like a threshold. Caleb closed the journal with care and set it back in his hands, as if returning a sacred thing to its rest. He looked around the room, at the bed, the desk, the cracked window, the patient dog, and the old woman who had carried her silence for so many years. Then he understood that the house had not simply kept a secret. It had preserved a blessing until the right hearts arrived to receive it. And somewhere deep in the quiet, where grief and grace often meet without warning, a larger mercy had already begun to unfold. The room seemed to breathe with them in the silence that followed, the old house settling around its own memories as if it, too, had been waiting for someone to listen. Caleb stood near the window with the dog at his side, one hand resting lightly on the shepherd's head while his eyes moved over the dim corners of the bedroom. The rain had softened into a steady whisper against the glass, and outside, the wind moved through the bare branches with the slow patience of something ancient and kind. Beatrice remained seated on the edge of the bed, the journal on her lap now, the envelopes gathered close in her hands like pieces of a life she had almost lost forever. For a long moment, none of them spoke. There are truths that need no interruption. They only need a place to land. And in that small, quiet room, with dust in the sunlight and the scent of old cedar in the air, truth was landing at last. Beatrice lowered her gaze to the journal, her fingers tracing the worn cover as though she were reading the years through touch alone. "I have not looked at these things in so long," she said at last, her voice soft and uneven, but no longer brittle. "I used to think that if I kept them locked away, the past would stay where I put it." Caleb did not answer right away. He knew better than to hurry a heart that had spent decades learning how to be still. Sable shifted once, then sat more upright, alert to the change in the room, as if he sensed that something important was unfolding, something delicate and impossible to rush. Caleb finally said, "Sometimes what we lock away is only waiting for the right light." Beatrice gave a small, trembling nod. Her eyes lifted toward him, and in them was a fatigue deeper than age, but also something else now, something more tender. Relief, perhaps. Or the first breath of it. She opened the top envelope with careful fingers. Inside was a folded page, yellowed at the edges, the handwriting thin but deliberate. She stared at it as if the lines might vanish if she looked too hard. "This is from my husband," she murmured. "Written before he went away." Caleb glanced toward the page, then back to her face. The old house seemed to listen. Even the rain had gone quieter. Beatrice read in silence for several seconds, her lips moving without sound, and then one hand rose to cover her mouth. Her eyes filled, but not with the sharp tears of grief alone. There was wonder in them too, and something like gratitude, fierce and almost holy. "He says," she whispered, voice shaking, "if anything happens and I do not make it back, do not let the house become a prison. Let it become a shelter. Let it hold the people who need rest." She stopped there, unable to go on. Caleb felt the weight of those words settle across the room like a mantle. The old man who had written them was gone, but his kindness had not ended. It had waited. It had hidden itself inside wood and paper and silence until it could still do good. Beatrice pressed the letter to her chest. For a moment, she looked less like a woman burdened by years and more like someone being gently returned to herself. "I never understood why he sealed these away," she said. "I thought it meant he did not trust me. I thought maybe he wanted the house to remain untouched, preserved, forgotten." She shook her head slowly. "But he was not hiding from me. He was protecting something." Caleb looked around the room again, at the narrow bed, the old dresser, the framed photograph fading on the wall, the shepherd sitting with calm vigilance, and the woman whose life had been narrowed by sorrow for far too long. "Maybe he was protecting you too," he said. "From having to carry it before you were ready." Beatrice exhaled through a fragile laugh that sounded like a prayer made audible. "You speak like a man who has learned the hard things." Caleb's mouth lifted at the corner, not quite a smile, but something near it. "I have had my share." Outside, the wind touched the house again, and somewhere in the distance a branch tapped softly against the siding, a sound like a knuckle at the door. Sable's ears turned toward it, then relaxed. Nothing was wrong. The world was simply moving on. Beatrice rose slowly from the bed, holding the journal and the letter bundled close. She walked to the desk and placed them on its surface with reverence, then stood there with both hands resting on the wood as though drawing strength from it. "There is another place," she said after a moment. "A place. My husband would not let me enter. He called it the back room, though it was never truly a room at all. Just a narrow space behind the kitchen wall. He kept it locked with a key I never saw. After he died, I was too afraid to ask what was inside." Caleb turned fully toward her. "And you think it may be connected?" "I do," she said. "He once said the house held more than memories." I thought he was speaking of grief. But now, her voice drifted off, and she looked toward the doorway as if it had grown a little farther away. Caleb did not hesitate. "Then we should see it." Beatrice hesitated only a second before nodding. Sable rose with them, nails tapping softly against the worn floorboards as the three of them moved out into the hallway. The house was dimmer there, the light thinner, the walls lined with photographs and old hooks and a framed embroidery that read "Bless this home" in faded thread. Caleb noticed how each step carried a history. The boards bowed slightly beneath their weight. The air held the scent of cooked onions long gone and cedar polish in time itself. Beatrice led them slowly toward the back of the house, her hand gliding along the wall as though guiding herself through a memory. At the end of the hall, near the kitchen, there was a section of wall paneling that looked no different from the rest, except for one almost invisible seam near the floor. Beatrice stopped there. "I had forgotten this was even here," she said, though her voice suggested she had never forgotten at all. Caleb crouched, running his fingers along the edge. The wood was old, but well made. A hidden latch, perhaps. He looked up at her. "May I?" She nodded once. Then, with a slow breath that seemed to gather the courage of years, she stepped back. Caleb pressed gently along the seam until he found the catch. It gave with a soft click that sounded impossibly loud in the stillness. Sable let out one low breath, ears forward. The panel shifted inward a fraction, releasing a faint current of air from somewhere behind the wall. It was cool, stale, and touched with the dry scent of paper, dust, and something older still, like a room that had been waiting in darkness for a very long time. Beatrice closed her eyes. "Oh," she whispered. Caleb pulled the panel open just enough to reveal a narrow passage and the edge of a small room beyond. What they saw there made them all go still. Shelves lined the far wall. Boxes sat neatly stacked. A lantern rested on a stool. And on the center shelf, wrapped in a clean cloth, was something that looked too carefully placed to be forgotten. Beatrice reached for Caleb's arm before she could stop herself. Her fingers trembled. "That was never there before," she said. But Caleb was already looking deeper into the room, where the light from the hallway touched the corner of a heavy metal box, old and weathered, with a brass plate fastened to the front. On the plate, in faded lettering, were 3 words that made Beatrice inhale sharply. Her hand flew to her chest. Caleb read them aloud in a low voice, as if speaking too loudly might wake the past too soon. "For the one who returns." The room seemed to hold its breath. For a long moment, none of them moved. Then Beatrice began to cry, not with fear, but with the strange, shattering tenderness that comes when a hidden sorrow is finally answered by truth. And Caleb, standing beside her in the doorway with Sable steady at his leg, understood that they had not just opened a wall. They had opened a promise. Caleb did not move for several seconds. The small room felt older than the house itself, as if it had been waiting in silence for a pair of living hands to find it again. Beatrice stood with one hand pressed over her mouth, tears gathering without sound, while Sable remained still at Caleb's side, his ears forward and his amber eyes fixed on the box as though he, too, understood the weight of what had been uncovered. The hallway light stretched across the floorboards in a narrow gold line, touching the brass plate, the dust on the lid, and the edges of the forgotten walls. Nothing in the room looked touched by time. Everything looked paused. At last Caleb stepped closer. He knelt beside the box, one knee creaking softly against the wood floor, and ran his fingers over the cold metal latch. The box was heavier than it looked. Even before he opened it, he could feel that it held more than paper or keepsakes. There was a stillness around it that felt deliberate, almost reverent. Beatrice whispered his name, but she did not ask him to stop. She seemed to know, in the quiet, that some doors only open once, and only after the heart has been ready enough to bear what waits behind them. Caleb lifted the latch. The sound was small, yet it seemed to travel through the whole house. Inside the box lay a stack of envelopes tied with a faded blue ribbon, a black and white photograph wrapped in wax paper, and a leather journal with soft worn edges from years of careful hands. Nothing glittered. Nothing looked valuable to anyone who did not understand memory. But the air around Beatrice changed the moment she saw the photograph. She made a fragile, broken sound and sank slowly into the chair by the wall. Caleb reached for the top envelope and saw his own name written on it in elegant, trembling script. For a long moment he only stared. Then he turned it over and found a seal pressed into the back, a small branch of birch trees encircling a single star. He looked at Beatrice, and she nodded through her tears as if she had been carrying this moment inside her for years. "Open it," she said softly. Caleb slid a thumb under the flap and unfolded the paper carefully, as though the words inside might dissolve if touched too roughly. The letter was short, but every line carried the kind of honesty that could only come from a life nearly finished. It spoke of love that had survived distance, of grief that had been carried alone too long, and of a promise made in the winter of 1978 to leave something behind for the person who would one day bring warmth back into the house. Caleb read it once, then again, slower this time, his breathing going shallow. The letter did not speak of money. It spoke of trust. It spoke of waiting. It spoke of a woman who had watched the world grow colder and had prayed that one day a kind man would arrive with a loyal dog and enough gentleness to keep a broken story from disappearing forever. Beatrice lowered her head and wept quietly into her hands. Outside, the wind moved through the birch branches with a low, silver hush. Caleb set the letter down and reached for the photograph. It showed Beatrice as a young woman standing beside a tall man in a wool coat, both of them smiling in front of this very house decades earlier. In the corner of the image, half in shadow, a younger Beatrice was holding the hand of a little boy. Caleb felt a slow pulse of astonishment move through him. There was a family here. There had always been a family here. The journal, when he opened it, held dates, recipes, weather notes, and names written with a tenderness that made every page feel alive. There were sketches of the house, the orchard, the old well near the back fence, and the little room behind the wall where Beatrice had hidden the things she could not bear to lose. Then, near the middle of the book, Caleb found a page marked with a folded corner. The handwriting changed there, becoming tighter, more urgent, and the words carried a quiet instruction: when the right one comes, give him the key beneath the clock. Caleb looked up at the mantel. Above the old fireplace stood a wooden clock covered in dust. He crossed the room, lifted it with care, and found a small brass key taped behind it. Beatrice gave a trembling laugh through her tears, the kind that comes when sorrow and relief arrive together. Caleb returned to the box and unlocked a hidden compartment beneath the lining. Inside was a deed, several faded bank envelopes, and a sealed statement from a lawyer in the next county. Beatrice's voice shook as she explained that her husband had left the property to her long ago, but she had spent years fearing the house would be sold before she could bring herself to open the sealed room. The lawyer, she said, had told her to wait until the right person appeared. She had not known what that meant until Caleb and Sable walked into her life. Caleb did not speak. He simply stood there, paper in hand, feeling the strange, steady truth of it settle into him. He had come to Birchlight Bay with nothing but fatigue, old grief, and a dog who never stopped believing that their lives still had room for one more good thing. Now, in a room hidden behind a wall, he had been given proof. That kindness was never lost, only waiting in the dark for the right moment to return. Beatrice reached for his arm with a hand that trembled less than before. Her smile was wet with tears, but it carried the first bright shape of peace he had seen on her face. "Your dog knew," she whispered, looking down at Sable. The shepherd blinked once, calm and certain, as if he had simply done what he was born to do. Caleb knelt and rested a hand on Sable's head. The dog leaned into him, warm and steady, and the room seemed to soften around them. The old house did not feel empty anymore. It felt remembered. And in that fragile, golden silence, Caleb understood that some inheritances are not measured in money or land, but in the mercy of being chosen to carry a story forward. Caleb stood there for a long moment, feeling the old house hold its breath around him. The hidden room was still and dim, yet it no longer felt like a place of fear. It felt like a place that had been waiting patiently, as if the walls themselves had kept watch over a promise made long ago. Beatrice sat slowly in the chair beside the desk, one hand pressed to her chest, the other resting on the faded edge of a ledger that had survived decades of dust and silence. Her fingers traced the worn cover with the care of someone touching a photograph of a face she had loved and lost. Outside, the afternoon light had softened into a pale gold, slipping through the narrow window and laying a quiet shine across the floorboards. Sable remained close to Caleb, his body still and alert, his amber eyes moving from the doorway to Beatrice and back again, as if he understood that this was not a moment to interrupt. He had brought them here, and now he seemed content to guard the silence that followed. Beatrice opened the ledger with trembling patience. The first pages were filled with careful handwriting, old dates, lists of repairs, names of neighbors, and notes about hard winters and lost harvests. Caleb leaned in, reading without speaking. The language was simple, but there was something sacred in it. It was a record of ordinary days, and somehow that made it feel even more important. People had lived here, worked here, prayed here, and loved here. They had carried worry in their pockets and still found ways to leave behind kindness. Page by page, the story of the house began to gather shape. One entry mentioned a storm that had ripped through the valley and taken the roof from the north room. Another spoke of a winter when the well froze so hard they had to melt snow on the stove just to drink. Then, near the middle of the ledger, Caleb found a page that made him pause. The handwriting changed slightly, becoming smaller, as if the writer had lowered their head while writing. It noted that a parcel of land behind the house had been set aside years ago, not for sale, but for shelter. There was no grand announcement, no legal language that sounded rich or powerful. Just a simple note that the property should belong to whoever carried the place with care when the time came. Beatrice read those words twice, and then again. Her eyes filled, but this time the tears did not seem heavy. They seemed relieved, like rain finally reaching dry ground. "My father used to say this house would remember us," she said softly. "I thought he meant the photographs, or the furniture, or the names in the attic trunks. I never knew he meant this. Caleb looked around the room, then back to the ledger. In that quiet moment, he understood why Sable had insisted on the wall, why the faint sound behind the plaster had carried such urgency. It was not only a hidden room. It was a reminder that no life is truly wasted when it has been lived with care. The world forgets many things too quickly, but some small acts remain, folded inside wood and stone, waiting for the right hands to uncover them. Beatrice rose carefully and walked to the old shelf near the far wall. Her fingers moved over a row of dust-covered boxes until she found a tin case no larger than a loaf of bread. Inside were folded letters tied with faded ribbon, a pressed flower gone brittle with age, and a black and white photograph of a young couple standing in front of the house on what looked like the day it was first built. Beatrice touched the photograph and smiled through tears. "That is my mother," she whispered. "And that is the summer they moved in?" Caleb studied the faces in the picture. They looked proud, tired, and hopeful all at once, the way people often do when they build a life with more faith than money. He felt something inside him settle, like a knot loosening after years of being pulled too tight. He thought of all the rooms he had slept in that never felt like home, all the roads he had traveled without knowing where he belonged, and all the nights when silence had felt heavier than any burden he could carry. Here, in this forgotten room, surrounded by the history of a family who had endured with dignity, he felt the first quiet answer to a question he had stopped asking. Belonging was not always a place on a map. Sometimes it was a moment when one tired soul recognized another and chose to stay. Sable let out a low, content breath and lay down beside Caleb's boot. Beatrice laughed softly at the sound, and the laugh carried a gentle surprise, as though she had not expected her own heart to remember how. The hidden room seemed to grow warmer, not from heat, but from the presence of truth. Caleb closed the ledger and set it back on the desk. He did not need more proof. The room had already told him enough. A house like this did not survive because timber was strong or nails were old. It survived because someone had once believed that shelter, memory, and mercy were worth preserving. And now that belief had been handed forward, not as a burden, but as a blessing. Beatrice looked at Caleb with eyes that held both gratitude and something deeper, something like recognition. "You came here for a lamp and left with a life," she said, almost smiling. Caleb gave a small, tired nod, unable to argue with the truth of it. He looked at Sable, then at the old walls, then at the woman who had opened her door when the world had expected her to keep it shut. In that fragile hour, he understood that miracles rarely arrived in thunder. More often, they came quietly, through a door left ajar, through a dog that would not stop barking, through a stranger who chose kindness when it would have been easier to pass by. The afternoon light faded a little more, and the room deepened into amber shadow. Somewhere in the house, a pipe gave a soft, settling click. Beatrice did not flinch. Caleb did not move. Sable kept his eyes open, calm and watchful, as if he had already learned the shape of peace and meant to protect it. And in the stillness of that hidden room, with the ledger resting closed and the photograph held gently in Beatrice's hands, the three of them sat inside a small, living miracle, each one changed in a way that could not be measured, only felt. "I can do that, but I do not have the actual Part 5 story text or the exact title in your message, so I cannot continue the narrative consistently without risking inventing details that may break your continuity. Please paste the full Part 5 content or the exact shot title so I can write Part 6 in one single bracketed block exactly as requested." "I can do that, but I do not have the actual Part 6 story text or the exact shot title in your message, so I cannot continue the narrative consistently without risking inventing details that may break your continuity. Please paste the full Part 6 content or the exact shot title so I can write Part 7 in one single bracketed block exactly as requested." "I can do that, but I do not have the actual Part 7 story text or the exact shot title in your message, so I cannot continue the narrative consistently without risking inventing details that may break your continuity. Please paste the full Part 7 content or the exact shot title so I can write Part 8 in one single bracketed block exactly as requested." By the time the first light of morning touched the windows, the house had already begun to feel different. Not newer, not larger, only kinder, as if the walls themselves had taken a long breath and decided to stay. The veteran stood in the kitchen with a mug of black coffee warming his hands, while the dog lay near the back door, his head resting on his paws, eyes half open, listening to every soft sound in the old house. Outside, the frost was slowly lifting from the grass, and the orchard beyond the fence shone with a silver sheen under the pale American sky. The air carried the clean scent of pine, wet earth, and wood smoke from a neighbor's chimney far down the road. It was the kind of morning that made even a tired heart believe in second chances. He looked around the room again, still unable to understand how life could change so quietly. Only yesterday, he had been living with the weight of uncertainty on his shoulders, always one bad day away from losing everything. Now there was a roof above him, a warm floor beneath his boots, and a silence that did not feel empty anymore. It felt steady. It felt earned. The woman had said the house was hers, but he knew better than to think of it that way. Nothing this beautiful had ever belonged to just one person. It had been passed through time, through grief, through memory, and somehow he had been chosen to carry it forward. The dog lifted his head when the floorboard near the hallway gave a faint creak. Not alarmed, only attentive, as if he had begun to learn the rhythm of the house the way he learned the rhythm of the man beside him. The veteran smiled at that, the smallest lift of his mouth, then set the coffee down and walked toward the hallway. The narrow passage still held the old scent of lavender polish and cedar. On one side hung family photographs in faded frames, black and white faces from another era looking out with the calm patience of people who had long ago accepted the passing of time. On the other side, a small table stood beneath a lace runner, and on that table rested a brass lamp with a cracked shade, its surface glowing faintly in the morning light. He paused there, remembering how the old woman had touched that same lamp the night before, her fingers trembling just slightly as she told him it had belonged to her mother. She had not spoken much, but what she did say had stayed with him. Some homes are not built to keep money. They are built to keep people. The words came back to him now with a gentle force. He had known hunger. He had known cold, the kind that worked its way into the bones and stayed there. He had known what it meant to feel forgotten by the world. Yet in this house, with its creaking beams and patient windows, he felt something he had almost lost the memory of. He felt seen. The dog rose slowly and followed him into the hallway, nails tapping softly against the worn floorboards. Together they stopped at the door that led to the small room at the end of the hall, the one the woman had unlocked only after she had seen the dog watching it too carefully. The door was plain, painted cream, and older than the others, with a brass knob dulled by time. It had no mystery left in it now, only a quiet promise. Inside, the room held little more than a narrow bed, a wooden chest, and a window that looked out over the orchard. But it was enough. On the chest sat a folded blanket, fresh and clean, and beneath it a handwritten note in careful, slanted script. He picked it up and read it once, then again. It was not long. It did not need to be. It spoke of gratitude, of patience, of a life lived with loss and still choosing tenderness. It told him that the house had been waiting for someone who would not treat it like a prize, but like a responsibility. The dog pressed his nose gently against the veteran's knee, as if he understood that the note mattered, even if he could not read it. The man bent down and scratched behind his ears. "Looks like we were meant to stay a while," he murmured. The dog answered with a slow blink, and then both of them turned toward the window. Outside, the orchard branches moved in the morning breeze, their bare limbs carrying the first hint of spring beneath the winter chill. A cardinal landed on the fence post, bright as a spark of life against the gray morning. The sight stayed with him. He thought of how often people expected miracles to arrive loudly, with thunder and flashing skies and some grand moment no one could ignore. But what if the greater miracles came this way instead? In a warm kitchen. In a small room with a clean blanket. In a note written by a hand that had already done the hard work of loving others for many years. In the steady breath of a dog who chose to remain close. The woman found him an hour later, standing by the window with the note still in his hand. She was wrapped in a wool shawl, her silver hair pinned neatly back, her face tired but peaceful. She smiled when she saw where he was looking. "The birds always come back first," she said softly. "They know where safety lies." He nodded, then told her the room was beautiful in its own simple way. She touched the doorframe with one palm and looked around as if seeing the house through his eyes now. "My husband used to say a house is only truly full when someone lonely can sleep inside it without fear," she said. Her voice was thin, but there was strength in it still. Maybe that is why this place was never meant to stay empty. The veteran said nothing right away. He was not a man who wasted words when silence could carry them better. Instead, he helped her into a chair by the window, then brought her a blanket and tucked it around her shoulders. The dog settled at her feet without being asked, his chin resting on the rug, his eyes closing for a moment as if he too understood this was a place of rest. Soon the kettle began to sing again in the kitchen. Sunlight moved slowly across the old wood floor. Somewhere beyond the orchard, a truck passed on the road, then faded into the distance. Life was still life. It would still bring trouble, bills, worry, and long nights. But for this one morning, none of that ruled the room. There was only warmth, and memory, and the quiet miracle of being given a place to begin again. The veteran looked at the woman, then at the dog, then back out at the orchard where the first birds of the morning were beginning to stir the branches. He felt something settle inside him, not loudly, but completely. Perhaps that was what grace looked like in ordinary clothes. Not a voice from the clouds, not a blazing sign, only a door that opened at the right time, to the right heart, for the right reason. And in that small house, under the pale and patient light of an American morning, he finally understood that he had not been rescued only to survive. He had been spared so he could belong.